If you guys have questions, we are going to do a panel after this portion of the presentation, so I'm happy to answer them at that point, but I'll also leave a couple minutes, hopefully, if I do it right, at the end of the presentation, okay? So I think it's fair to start with what is stalking. And we're going to echo this information a little bit when we go through the statute, because nationally, most of the statutes on stalking law come from this basic definition. But it's a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So that is what stalking is. That is what the laws throughout the country seek to prevent, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I think one of the most jarring things when I started in this position was learning how prevalent stalking is. And I think not only how prevalent stalking is, but how prevalent it is in combination with how underreported it is and how little we see it, or we're seeing it in the criminal justice system when I started. But the statistics are that 1 in 3 women experience stalking at some point in their lives, and 1 in 6 men. Another statistic that the more you do this type of work, the more you see, is that people that have stalked before end up coming back, and it's not always with the same victim. Sometimes they have a new victim that they're stalking, but the statistics demonstrate that 1 in 3 stalkers have actually stalked before. When we go through some of these cases today, we'll talk a little bit about how you see that pretty consistently, and certainly in terms of stalking the same individual, even where there's breaks and intervention of the criminal justice system, and that stalking continues. So who are the stalkers? I focused on these 2 specific numbers because obviously I run the domestic violence unit, so this is sort of the bread and butter, right? There's a lot of different categories of people that can be stalked, but a large proportion of that, almost half, is family members and intimate partners, which is obviously a really jarring statistic in stalking cases. In terms of who is being stalked, I wanted to take a minute before I jumped into some other statistics to just recognize that I think the answer is we don't know. What we do know is that stalking is incredibly underreported. What we know is that intimate partner violence has a very high prevalence and is more underreported in minority communities. And so while we have statistics that represent some of the populations, I think that there is a really big number of cases that make it very hard to talk about the breakdown of race and ethnicity and financial demographics in stalking. I think the answer is anyone can be stalked, but I don't think there's a lot of data yet on who it is that gets stalked most or more frequently. But what the data does show in terms of age demographics is that more than 1 million people over the age of 50 are stalked each year. And that's not to say that people that are older are stalked more, because in looking at individuals between 18 and 24, they actually have the highest rates of stalking. Many of college victims will tell friends. This is a huge demographic of underreporting, normalized behaviors, thinking that people just can't accept the breakup and things like that. We talked about sort of race and ethnicity, but one of the areas that does have some data, again, I would argue that it's probably highly underreported, is LGBTQ+, and it's 40% of same-sex intimate partner stalking victims were stalked for more than a year, which is a really prolonged period of time in a stalking case. 47% had stalkers that destroyed property, and 28% had stalkers who threatened to physically attack the victim or others close to them. That last point I think is really, really important. In order to have a stalking case, you do not need to have a threat of physical violence. You don't need to have any threat at all. And what you'll see when we go through today in the case study and some of the stories from individuals that they're just from YouTube, right? I don't know them, they didn't come across my desk. But some of the similarities are that there aren't necessarily threats of violence, and there's not always a history of violence in some of those cases where stalkers can become incredibly violent or it can become fatal. And so I think that that's really important as we jump into sort of the legal side. In terms of the identification and the prosecution of these cases, when I train law enforcement, my joke is don't sleep on stalkers. The guy that's leaving a taco on her car at work can be just as dangerous as the guy that strangled her 52 times before. You do not know. And so to write off the flowers or the gift giving, to write off the apology texts, is probably one of the most dangerous things you can do in investigating stalking cases, and we'll see that through the case study. All right, so I said I was going to jump into the law. One of the things that I find when I train law enforcement throughout the state is that some statutes are incredibly complex. Stalking actually isn't one of them. Stalking is very user-friendly in terms of the elements and the statutory components and requirements. Proving the cases are very difficult, charging them or not. And so in order to charge a stalking case, you have to have these following elements: that the defendant knowingly engages in a course of conduct directed at a specific person, and that the conduct would cause a reasonable person to either fear significant injury or suffer mental anguish. I note down here, and I know it's probably small, so I'll just let you guys know what it is. It doesn't require on the mental anguish side that somebody had to get counseling or treatment. There's no requirement that they actually had to seek that to demonstrate that there was the mental anguish. One other thing that I would note on this, and this is a really, really big component in charging these cases, the conduct would cause a reasonable person. It does not require that the conduct cause fear to the person being stalked. That is incredibly important in stalking and domestic violence cases, because a lot of the time your domestic violence victim is going to have counterintuitive victim behavior, right? So they're going to be going back to his house. They're going to be found in a car together. And a lot of these behaviors are because they're actually trying to protect themselves, right? They're going to be the best indicator of their own safety. But that doesn't mean that it's not stalking just because she's not doing these typical do not contact me, she's running away, she's hiding. That's not required to charge someone with stalking. It is that a reasonable person under those circumstances would have that fear or that mental anguish. Course of conduct, actually really easy. It means 3 or more separate incidents. And what those incidents can be defined as is incredibly broad. So including but not limited to acts in which the person directly, indirectly, or through third parties. So that means they can contact, they can have their friend or their mom contact. It means they can post those things on Instagram with the tag or with the caption that is clearly directed at this victim by the content, right? These are all forms of this contact. It does not require that they're showing up at their job, that they're showing up at their house. That is not a requirement. And it's that they follow, monitor, observe, survey, threaten, communicate about another or interfere with, jeopardizes, damages, or disrupts another's daily activity, property, employment, business, career, education, or medical care. That is a very inclusive list, right? That is any disruption to a person's life caused by 3 or more separate incidents of contact, which can be direct, indirect, or through a third party. So when you have, and I'll switch actually to the next slide, when you have those cases in law enforcement where you see the violations of the no contact order over and over and over again, or the violation from the protection from abuse order over and over and over again, on your third hit, you should be thinking stalking if those are in a close period of time. And we'll talk a little bit about the timing, but there's a lot of ways that we can explain gaps in stalking timing, right? So they don't have to be 3 in a week. They don't have to be 3 in a month. There isn't a finite period of time that you need to get to a stalking. I've had a case before where a defendant was charged with stalking. Actually, he was Taco on cars. He was also calling her job and reporting that she was a nurse and that she was stealing medication, trying to get her fired from her job. He was contacting her incessantly through social media and through her phone using blocked numbers. So there was all this different conduct. We charged him with stalking. He pled guilty to stalking, and he got I think a 7-month period of incarceration. When he got out, 2 days later, she gets a phone call from a blocked number. The next day she gets a phone call and answers it, and it's him. We charged him with stalking again. The way that we were able to do that is this. There are specific components of the stalking statute that specifically state that prior charges, even if they were resolved, even if they were convictions but not necessarily, can be used in your course of conduct for a new stalking. So while you need 3 to charge a person with stalking initially, You don't need 3 more. It's not a stalking refresh if you have a period of time that didn't restart. And so that's specifically allowed in the statute and something we've charged, and he pled guilty to stalking again. He did a minimum mandatory period of a year. He did more than a year, but there was a minimum mandatory period of a year the second time. So that is something that you're thinking about, because while I had that gap in time of over 7 months, while he actually didn't contact her while he was incarcerated, that doesn't mean that my stalking has to start over in terms of timeline, and that doesn't mean that my stalking has to start over in terms of 3 or more acts. So there are a lot of ways that we can utilize this statute. And there's some interesting caveats to it that come to the prosecution of it, right? So if I've already convicted somebody of 2 acts of violation of no contact orders, and then there's a third thing that happens and we want to charge stalking, I don't get to reconvict them of the violations of the acts of no contact orders. They've already been convicted of that, but I can use them to talk about stalking in that time frame. And so these are the kinds of things that you guys want to be thinking about when you're looking to identify these cases, really whatever area that you work in. When you're trying to listen to people and hear these things and identify these things, don't think, oh, well, he was already convicted of that, so she shouldn't call the police. That doesn't necessarily stand true when those actions are ongoing. Obviously, my goal would be report it, get it on my desk, and then we'll take a look. So stalking degrees and penalties, I'm not going to go through this at length, but I did want to point out a couple things. Your run-of-the-mill stalking case, can you guys see I'm standing in your way? Your run-of-the-mill stalking case is going to be a Class G felony, so that's a 0 to 2 year sentence. There are aggravating factors that are going to get it up into a Class F, and that's in this big middle box here. So you have some age requirements, whether the victim's over 62, or if you have a victim under 14 and a defendant over 21. You have threats of death or threats of serious injury. So if you have a stalking and a terroristic threatening, you can get right here in your Class F. If you have physical injury, so if you have an assault third or an assault second within your stalking, you're going to get up to this Class F, and that brings it to 0 to 3. The one I have highlighted for you guys here is the most utilized subsection to bump up your degree of stalking, and that is that the person has an inactive order prohibiting contact. So that can be your criminal no contact order if they have that pending case, or it can be a protection from abuse order in this state or any other state. I note that because, first of all, when you have your non-comp, you're immediately here in your Class F. You're also immediately at a 6-month minimum mandatory sentence for the violation of the no contact order in the stalking context. That's within the statute. So that's really helpful in having, some of these cases with the repetitive violations, and I know that everyone that works with domestic violence victims sees those. That can be charged as stalking. Those can be utilized to bump it up to a minimum mandatory period of time. It also gets your maximum penalty up to 3 years, which is a little better than 2 in terms of what you can do when they're violating probation after the fact. And then you have your big one, which is all the way up to the Class C. That's when you have the person possessing a deadly weapon or serious physical injury caused during. So if you have an assault second, I used as an example before, but that person needed stitches, that's going to bring you up to your Class C. You still have that minimum mandatory presumption in the violation of the no contact order, even if you get up to that limit of 15. I love this slide. I think that this is the best demonstration that I can give to you guys from statistics to talk about how much stalking is happening and not recognized. So when I started pulling data. Like I said, we started focusing on a couple types of crimes, and I pulled data on stalking cases specifically. In 2018 and 2019, we had 13 and 9. 2020, we had 14. But in November of 2020, all masked up, I did my first big stalking law enforcement training to one agency. The next year, we had 74 stalking cases. One training, one agency. That was the uptick in stalking cases. That doesn't mean more people started stalking that year, although it was a very terrible year in terms of statistics. But that's already there, right? We just weren't identifying, we weren't charging, we weren't utilizing the statute appropriately. So 2022 was relatively consistent. It went from 74 to 64, and these are all in Newcastle County alone, not statewide. We identified a stalking specialist in Newcastle County to start pulling cases and looking at the cases that were in family court as your non-comp, right? Your repetitive misdemeanor cases. Start looking at those, reviewing those, and pulling those up. And last year we had 103 stalking cases come through in Newcastle County. And so 13.9 to 103 is a huge jump, and there wasn't an increase. This was always happening, right? This is just utilizing the statute effectively, identifying those cases and using this charge the right way. And we've had some really, really good results last year. We were, I think, 6 out of 7 felony stalking convictions at trial, which is huge for domestic violence. We had 2 victimless prosecutions for stalking. Those 2 prosecutors are actually in the room. And we had our first 2 forfeiture by wrongdoing motions, which is a huge tool in domestic violence. I'll save you the boring part, but basically, if a defendant is making threats or influencing a victim to not come and testify at trial, and we can demonstrate that, we can use all of those statements because they've waived the right to say that they're hearsay and confrontation clause and a bunch of other things. So prison calls in DV cases are huge. It's a great tool. They are almost always calling. They are almost always saying something that they shouldn't be saying. And so that has been really effective in prosecuting stalking cases. So I said before, I think it's incredibly important to identify and charge stalking correctly. Why do I think that? Well, I mentioned the link to lethality. It is incredibly high. And so the statistics are that 76% where an intimate partner, female intimate partner is killed, there was at least 1 episode of stalking within a year prior to the murder, and it's 85% for attempted murder. That is an incredibly jarring statistic, right? When you start analyzing fatal incidents in domestic violence, you're almost always going to see a stalking component, almost every single time. And I know we have a lot of different groups of people in this room from a lot of different places. Everybody's going to see it in some subset if you're working with domestic violence victims, even if it doesn't get reported. So start paying attention and flagging them. Try to get them reported when you can, because, trying to get these people to at least stop the stalking, it is more than that, right? It's trying to prevent this really scary worst case scenario. So I wanted to, hopefully this works. It's been 50-50 trying it before you all got here. I wanted to show you sort of an example of a woman who was stalked. This is actually in Baltimore, so not too far away.
Everyone. So this portion of the workshop, we have a really awesome panel set up for you all. The way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce everyone. We have some questions that are already prepared based off of some of the questions that you all submitted in your registration for this workshop. And then, time permitting, of course, we'll open up Q&A. So that way you all can ask questions. I do ask that we kind of keep questions related to Nicole's case not in during this panel time, because I am recording and we do want to respect her family. But if you have specific questions, I don't want to offer up. Maybe after or via email you can ask Jenna those specific questions. So I'm first going to introduce everyone. My name is Francisca. I'm the trainer educator at the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm going to first start off by introducing Jenna Malecki, who you know very well now. But Jenna Malecki is a Deputy Attorney General at the Delaware Department of Justice and is the current unit head of the Domestic Violence Unit. She's been a prosecutor working in Newcastle County, Delaware, since graduating from Widener Law School in 2012. During her time at DOJ, she has tried cases in various units within the office, ranging from misdemeanor offenses to sexual assault and homicide cases. In her current position, she handles domestic violence felony cases, as well as the supervision of domestic violence prosecutors who handle intimate partner and familial violence cases and child abuse cases in the Superior Court, Family Court, and the Court of Common Pleas. She also addresses issues in domestic violence investigations and prosecutions throughout the state. In her time in the Special Victims Unit and in her current position in the Domestic Violence Unit, she has focused her career on the protection of vulnerable victims, including women and children. She hopes to continue to support victims in the cases she prosecutes and to improve the criminal justice process for those affected by crime. Jen Cutney-Soper. Jen has worked as a victims services specialist in the Domestic Violence Unit at the Delaware Department of Justice since 2011. She has spent almost 20 years working with victims of crime, particularly victims of intimate partner violence and family violence. Jen is the chair of the Delaware Victims' Rights Task Force, chair of the LGBTQ+ Victims Services Subcommittee of the VRTF, lots of acronyms, and an active member of the Joint Task Force Legislative Subcommittee. They have participated in presenting educational and training materials to other victim services providers and advocates, students, attorneys, and law enforcement. Jen participates as a faculty member of the Delaware Victim Assistance Academy, which just happened last week. It was amazing, and a member of the DVCC Prevention and Education Committee. Jen is also the most recent past president of Delaware Pride. So that's Jen. And then last but not least, Nancy Castellanos. Nancy is the program director at Abriendo Puertas. Nancy graduated from Wilmington University with a degree in psychology and has been part of People's Place Abriendo Puertas program since 2009. Nancy is known as a strong advocate who is dedicated to serving the state's vulnerable community. She is passionate about leading her staff and educating the community about domestic violence and serving as a mentor to sustain human services professionals throughout their careers. As you can tell by my breathlessness, these are very impressive people. So if we could just give them a warm welcome right now. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into the questions because we have some good ones, and anyone can answer this one. What are some common misconceptions about stalking, particularly about marginalized communities, and how can we address and dismantle these misconceptions?
You guys are starting because they just listen to me talk.
I would like to answer that just based on a case that we had a few years back. Basically, it's just that in that case in particular, we had this woman thinking that he was taking care of her when he was stalking her. So it was difficult for her to really see what was going on in that when she was having all that. And the case was that when she was in her country, she was going to work, and she knew him, but they live in the same neighborhood. So, and every time that she would go to work, he was following her. So, and she says that maybe he quit his job because at the end of the day, when she was going back home, he was following her. So when she decided to confront him, he said that that area was very dangerous and he was just taking care of her. So she found that sweet. She found that like, okay, well, he's telling me that he worries about me. And she decided to date him when he proposed. So when they came to this country, he changed. So when she was in shelter, we talked about all these red flags.
Yeah.
But she couldn't see it at that time. So one thing that all of us know is that misconception is that he's taking care of me when he's just not doing that. So I think education is really important when we talk to them in any place that we meet them.
Yeah, sounds like healthy relationships education.
Yes.
Gotcha.
So that's just one case, but I just remember that one because I think that stuck with me because of all the nice things that he was doing, all the things that she said to her. So she thought he was a nice guy because he was protecting her.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I talk to victims about is that it's not the creepy guy lurking in the bushes, although clearly I was on the case with Jenna that she just talked about. Sometimes it is the creepy guy in the bushes looking in through your window, but I want to say like 90% of the time it's not. It is the guy that insisted you share your location with him because he wants to make sure you get where you're going safely. It's the guy that wants the passcode to your phone and for you to not use Face ID because he wants to be able to look at your messages. It's the partner that insists on you taking a photo to kind of prove you're at your parents' house because they're just worried that you might be out cheating or that something bad has happened. Just like let me know you're there and show me that you're actually where you say you are. Those are a lot of times kind of masked similarly to what Nancy said in this illusion of wanting to keep people safe and wanting to keep people like cared for and make them feel cared for, and when in reality what they're doing is they're monitoring your movements, they're monitoring who you're speaking to, they're monitoring whether or not you continue to have friendships, telling people like, oh, that person's toxic, you shouldn't keep talking to them because they don't like me, or she thinks, you know, badly of me, so you really should stay away from her. And that's more isolating behavior than, you know, actually caring about somebody's friendships and things along those lines. So kind of a lot of my job is done in helping people recognize, similarly to Nancy, those red flags that have been happening, and that this is actually stalking behavior, not, you know, somebody pretending like they care about you.
And after Jen convinces them of those things, then I have to convince a jury of those things. And so it's really nice to sit in a room where I'm going to talk about a bunch of misconceptions that people outside this room have, right? Like, what a great space. But trying to explain to jurors why, and this is back to that reasonable person, you know, component, right? Why she isn't acting fearful, why she isn't leaving, why she's back in the car with him by choice, without being able to say those things that they just said, right? Without talking about all of the things that they believed in their heads was a good thing that turned out to not be. But more than that, especially in your marginalized communities, you have to keep in mind what was modeled for a lot of people is not healthy, right? And so they're doing what they learned to do from the relationships that were put before them when they were younger, and that's setting some really concerning ideals, right, in what's appropriate and what's not. But more than that, when we're talking about stalking behaviors and domestic violence generally, the inability to leave for so many different reasons, right, and I don't have to tell you all of them, but financially being a big one, right? And stalking isn't that bad, right? He's just keeping her safe, following her to work. He's just asking for a picture when she gets to her parents' house. He's just bringing her tacos at work, right? It's not a strangulation, it's not an assault, it's not that bad. And so for even those cases where you have those really horrific assaults and sexual assaults where they're justifying going back because they can't live without this person financially or otherwise, and then on top of that, stalking's not that bad. It's just, you know, behavior that may or may not have been modeled for him and sometimes gets annoying. I think it is very difficult to explain to people that don't have the understanding of domestic violence what's happening and why decisions are being made by a person in that relationship.
Yeah, you all touched on a lot of the questions we're going to ask. Almost like prepared for that. So, yeah, I'm hearing a lot of, we touched on a lot of things. One of the things I don't know if it was in the case study that you did, Jenna, or if it was in one of the videos, because a lot of them were very similar, but just this notion of like, I'm a good guy. Like, I'm doing this because I'm a good person and I'm a good partner, and I think that's something that we hear a lot, and so I'm just kind of reflecting out loud. But I do want to go back to, I think, something that, Jen, you were talking a lot about with technology, because as we saw in a lot of these videos and in this case study, technology played a huge role in these cases. So how can technology be a tool for stalking? Because this is also a question that the participants had as well. And I think we've kind of answered this, but if there's anything left that wasn't addressed that you think is important for people to know.
I think in our case, not most of the time, but we have seen cases where they have a contract with the phone company and he has the account. So he's gonna be able to see everything that she's doing, everything where she's going, everywhere where she's going. So that's something that when they get to shelter, we try to find out what's the deal in that part. So and if we can offer a cell phone, we're gonna do that. We're gonna turn off their cell phones, enable the GPS, and give them a new phone, just to be sure that they're gonna be safe while we're working with them, and that they're safe. So that's something that we have talked to the women in shelter, and I think that's worked.
Yeah, that's a really good consideration, because I think Jen was mentioning find your friends, Snapchat, you can see people's locations, so I think that's a really good consideration to have, especially for shelter.
Yeah, I think technology safety planning is something I do in probably 99% of my stalking cases at this point. I am grateful for having colleagues that are younger than me at this point, and also I have teenagers. And so I've learned way more about location services than I ever wanted to know, and it creeps me out. But talking with people, did this person have access to your physical phone? Because if so, I want you to really consider the possibility of seeing if there's a way to find a new physical phone. Don't back it up from your cloud, because anything that they've put on your phone to track you could get carried over, and you may not even know that it's running in the background. Apps that I use as a parent, because I have a 15-year-old, to make sure that he is going to his friend's house like he tells me he's doing, are very easily abused to make sure that, you know, my partner is going where he says he's going, or you know, making sure that when you say you're going to your mom's, you're not actually going to your ex-boyfriend's house, which is like the biggest thing I hear. He constantly thought that I was cheating. And if you, especially if you have kids, you probably don't have time to cheat, let's be honest. But also things like, don't check into places on Facebook. Don't post on Facebook that you're going on vacation. These are generally good safety tips, period. If you've ever shared your location with a person, turn your location services off completely. Making sure that if you do have something like Snapchat, that you're not sharing your location or your data with Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram. You can get metadata out of photographs, and where that photograph was taken and what time. You know, there are apps that are doing keystroke logs and basically cloning a cell phone so that they see every single text messages, every single phone call, every single photo that was taken from that person's phone, sometimes in real time. And it's creepy. Technology we also see a lot, and it actually becomes a problem for Jenna and the other DAGs, where they're using things like TextNow. Has anybody know what TextNow is? Getting fake phone numbers from, I know Christina does. But basically, if you can connect to Wi-Fi, you can get a cell phone number. My kid used it before I actually got him on my cell phone plan to make sure he knew how to use a cell phone appropriately. But it allows a person to create spoof numbers, just fake phone numbers that you block one, another one starts calling, you block that one, a third one starts calling. And now we have cases with 15 different calls, and we know that it's that person, but how do we prove it? Which my part is safety planning, the proving it part is Jenna's job.
I mean, technology is a blessing and a curse for prosecutors, right? Like, I don't love that he was using Nicole's son's phone to hack into her iCloud account, right? Spoof numbers are a nightmare for us. When you send packages from joint accounts and we can't prove who sent the package, right? Who actually purchased the items. There is so much that offenders can do that we can't prove that we're doing. We know they're doing it. The victim knows they're doing it. We can't prove it. And that becomes really, really scary in the cases where they are stalking them. I want to get the charge on them because I'm afraid of what's going to happen next, but I can't prove that those numbers are him, right? I'm not going to tell her to answer the phone and hear his voice. And so, you know, it's a really, really difficult thing because the court process is so much slower than technology. So every time we get a handle on it, then it changes. And the companies are so resistant to law enforcement because they want to protect the privacy of their users. So it is a very effective tool for stalkers. And sometimes an effective tool for us if we can get the information, but not as frequently as it's a good tool for them.
Thank you all for answering that question. I'm going to kind of go back. You all have already touched on this topic, but I think it's important to talk about intersecting identities and how they impact a person's ability to access resources or to feel heard in these situations. So how do intersecting identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic status impact an individual's experience of stalking and their access to resources and support?
I can start and say, I'm gonna let you guys handle resources. Law enforcement investigations reflect challenges in their understanding of certain relationships in terms of genders, gender identities, and a lot of things. I think a lot in there, right? And reading a lot of police reports, I see it a lot in gay and lesbian couples, and where typically a male aggressor and a female victim is, the standard, right? But when they get called out to two women, and they're both saying the other one was the aggressor, they have no idea. I mean, they don't know what to do, and there's more cross charges. There's more, I don't want to say victim blaming, but the nuances of the way that they write their reports, the nuances of the way that these cases are investigated is different. And I've seen a lot of progress in that, which is really, really helpful in the last few years. But one of the things that I see a lot is where you have a victim that is transgender, and that is also very difficult for law enforcement in terms of initial aggressor and then the way that they respond to that case. So before they even get to the resources that are available to them, I mean, that first contact with the justice system, I think that there are, and I just focused on, gender identity and sexual orientation. That doesn't even go into race and ethnicity, right? It's there's so many barriers to communications with that first line of the criminal justice system that changes the way that a victim may interact with law enforcement, and then the way that law enforcement interacts with a victim, that makes cases really difficult to prosecute and makes, I think, the job of the resources provided, whether it's system or non-system based, so much harder because that trust has already been broken.
And yes, I think that's one of the things that we were talking on our way here, that every time that we have a lady in shelter, it's not for us to say she has to respect me. She has been dealing with all these agencies. We are one agency more. So our purpose is that she can feel safe, so she can let us know the things that she needs. So she's gonna feel safe with us, she's gonna feel comfortable, so we're gonna be able to provide better services if we know what's going on. So in that case, we have had women, one of them was it's a recent case that she was telling me that she went to family court for an ex parte, and the commissioner didn't understand why she gave the kids to him if she was so worried about it. And she explained, and she kind of get upset a little bit because she said, now you're questioning me because I was planning safety for myself and my kids. And the commissioner said, well, yes, I don't understand why you gave the kids to him if you were afraid. So she felt not supported, but at the end she got the BFA, BFA. But that was one of the questions that she made me. And I wasn't really sure how to answer, because we're supposed to be in the same channel, we're supposed to work for them, we're supposed to protect them, to help give the information, giving the education, and being empathic with them. So I didn't see that in that case, in that court, but I guess one of the challenges that we had in our case is that not to have the right translation services, that sometimes they don't get the right information. Policemen, they don't get the right information. They're using the kids, they're using the neighbor, sometimes they're using them to get the information. So I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have in our community. Just not to have the right resources.
I mean, having a child translate to law enforcement about stalking, domestic violence, that's horrible.
It is.
Like having to translate that for a parent in hospital settings, it happens all the time. So thank you for bringing that up. And then also, sometimes people, I'm thinking about the Latino community, because that's the community that I've worked with, not everyone speaks Spanish. And so sometimes people assume that because somebody's Latino, they speak Spanish, but that's not necessarily true. There's indigenous languages, there's Portuguese, there's different languages, so thank you for bringing that point up.
I just had a case this week where she spoke Portuguese, and they were trying on scene to use a translator app in Spanish, and it wasn't working. And one of the things, if you know about law enforcement investigations, it's in DV specifically, but all cases, it's really important to get everyone's side of the story, right? And they just didn't get hers. And so one of the things that when I started was very concerning to was children. Interviewing children when the offender's still there, very bad. Having a child translate for anyone, worse. And so that actually was one of the things we addressed pretty quickly. But what happens now is they don't interview her at all. And so, you're caught in these situations where in no circumstance should the child be used, but also I don't want her arrested because he speaks English and he gave a really good account of how she was the aggressor without her having the opportunity to give her side of the story, and I'm cleaning it up, after she has charges. And so it's a really difficult situation. It's not as easy as don't use child to translate. That's a great answer. It's the right one. But there needs to be another step in that investigation.
In those cases, we have offered our services. Every time that we have a police person calling, that's what we say. If you have these kind of situations when you have a phone call, just give us a call. You can call us and we can do the interpretation.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing that. I know and then being a translator versus someone that speaks the language is also like completely different. Like translators go to a class and take an exam, and so thank you for doing that work because it's definitely a gap in services in general. So.
Do they have access, do the police officers have access to the language line?
Yes. However, on scene, I find that they are not frequently using it because of the timeline. I've seen a lot more apps. I've seen bringing a Spanish-speaking officer on scene, which raises the concerns that you have where they're not translators. We had a case where there was an officer that spoke Spanish on scene. It was not his first language. He just spoke it, but he didn't understand the word she was using for strangulation. And she was going like this. I thought that was a pretty good tell, but you didn't get that either. So, we did it after the fact, and they didn't charge it. It was charged misdemeanors. And, by the time we got there, she had sort of changed her mind about the reporting. And I think that happens a lot, where even when you do all the steps to get the person that can speak the language, hopefully better than that one, but, and things don't get to the place that we need to go because it's just, whether it's dialect or imperfect knowledge of the language, they miss nuances and words that are important.
Yeah.
I also think that something we have to take into consideration, especially me and Jenna and our colleagues, who are through the criminal legal process, but I think everyone that works in any sort of system is a mistrust of official systems. A mistrust of law enforcement is a very common thing, particularly when you're talking about intersecting marginalized identities. So working within the queer community, there is a mistrust of being either misgendered or mistreated or, all of which are valid by law enforcement. But, I can't count how many times I've been told, we don't call the police in my neighborhood. I can't be seen as a snitch. I can't take the stand. And those are valid. They're valid concerns. They're valid safety concerns. And they're valid cultural concerns. We've had people don't want to interact, don't want to come to us because they think that I'll call ICE. They don't want to come to court because if they come to court, they might get deported. And those are valid concerns because, unfortunately, it has happened. And I think that we may be a little more used to that, particularly in prosecution. But I think that bleeds out into when you're interacting with official services, even outside the criminal legal process, not necessarily wanting to access healthcare, not necessarily wanting to access shelter services because of the concern that if I go into shelter, I'm going to be mistreated because I'm trans. Valid concern. Whether or not shelter services even exist for a person based on their gender identity or their sexual orientation. Whether that, person is able to go to the doctor because they don't have health insurance, or access emergency services and are afraid to get in an ambulance because it's going to cost them $1,000. Valid concern. And so I think that mistrust of systems is something that certainly needs to be taken into account when we're talking about, especially something like stalking, where a person's initially gonna feel like the cops are gonna think I'm crazy. And a lot of times, yes,
Well, and
they're gonna think you're crazy.
And layering onto that, they've been told that the cops are gonna think they're crazy, or they've been told that they're going to not be believed
Or their
because
kids
of
are
their
gonna
gender
get taken
identity,
away.
or because they're going to lose their kids, or that they're going, they're being told that by the abuser over and over and over again. If you call the police, you're gonna get deported. And so, while there's the mistrust generally, they're also conditioned to believe that that's gonna happen, and especially they're gonna believe you're crazy.
Yeah.
You look at those, because I see the body-worn camera from when the officers first get there, right? And you have your hysterical victim talking about things that have happened 3 years ago, and they're like, but what happened tonight? And she can't do it chronologically, because that's not how trauma works in the brain, right? That's not how your memories are formed. And he's gonna come out, he's gonna have scratches on him that are sort of defensive wounds, and he's gonna say, she just found out that I was cheating on her, she's bipolar, she's nuts. Don't believe her, look how normal and put together I am. And he does look normal and put together, right? He's given them all the tools to believe him and not believe her, and he told her that was gonna happen. And so a lot of the time, the mistrust is layered. There's more than one part of it. It's fed to them by the abuser as a mechanism for control, on top of all of those experiences that they have with the system or non-system, on their own, or from their parents, or wherever else it comes from.
Thank you all for answering that question. I know we probably could talk about that question for a really long time and still feel like there's more to say. So thank you all for taking trying your best to answer it in the amount of time that we have. But I wanna ask one more question and then open it up to the audience, because I'm sure you all have your own questions that you wanna ask. But the name of this workshop is Collaborative Approaches, and you all have identified the courts, shelter, you've identified law enforcement, all these different systems, all these different people that the survivor or the victim is having experiences with. And so how can collaborative approaches among different sectors that I just mentioned improve support and intervention for stalking victims, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, as you all have done a really good job of pointing out? Again, a big question, but what do you all think?
I can answer in 3 words.
Go for it.
Listen, the Family Justice Center is the future for this collaboration, right? It is putting various resources in one place with a core value system. It is enabling people that want to come in and seek resources but don't want to do it through the system to go to a place and have the option to do that without the threat of calling the police. And it's, and I think that that's a big part of it, right, is making it a safe place for people that want nothing to do with my office and nothing to do with the police, because I think that those people need the resources. Once you get into the system, we might not do it perfectly, but we're gonna get you to the places you need to go, right? Like, we can all communicate and we have those relationships, but if you don't ever wanna tell anyone, if you're in that marginalized section and you have the mistrust and you don't wanna be there, to have a place where you can go to get those places in one stop and potentially just one time recounting what's happening to you, as opposed to saying it over and over again. I think that's the future for how we collaborate more effectively than we are now.
And just so you all know, there are some one-pagers on Family Justice Center, the work that's being done in Delaware right now. In the back on that table where all of the name tags are and the coloring pages. So if you want more information on Family Justice Centers, there's one-pagers back there for you all to get some more information and get connected to the work that's being done in Delaware right now.
I think a good method of collaboration is identifying who your safe person is at different agencies. So I know that I'm going to use Melissa as an example, because I think we go through this phase where we talk every single day for 3 weeks, and then we don't hear from each other for like 2 months. And then we're back talking every single day for 2 weeks. And that is because we've developed this relationship where when there is an emergency, and I know it's Wilmington's jurisdiction, I know I can call Melissa and she's going to help me out. I know that if I have an offender harassing my victim from prison, and I can call Erin and she can usually fix it for me. If not, point me in the right direction of someone who can. So identifying those people in those agencies, I think it's incredibly important when you're talking about culturally specific services. I know if I'm working with somebody who's in Sussex and now they are dealing with a stalking situation, I can refer them to Abuela de Puertas if they're Spanish speaking, and I know that they're going to be safe and cared for in a space that appreciates a part of their identity that I don't have the ability to understand as a white person, right? As a white English speaking person from Delaware. That's a world I don't understand, but I know that if I send them Nancy's way, they're gonna be okay. And they're gonna have people who can point them in other areas within the community that I wouldn't otherwise know about. So I think a huge part of it is being able to identify those safe people within those systems that you developed your own relationship with. Because that one warm handoff usually makes a big difference.
And I'm gonna echo what they said, because having that person, I know we work a lot with Vivian. Thank you for everything. We have that good relationship with her and with Sadie. And we also have, I'm pretty excited about this new concept and project, because I think most of the time when we work with the women, something gets lost every time that they look for a service. So, and it's really complicated for them to repeat what they need, and it's getting lost every single time. So having that is just amazing. I think that's gonna be a really, it is a dream come true for me. So it's gonna be for the ladies, having all in the same place. So they're gonna feel safe, they're gonna feel protected, they're gonna feel believed. Because sometimes that's the problem. They don't want to leave their relationships because then again, they're being told no one is going to believe you. So now having that safe place, being able to say what they really feel and how they feel and being understood, it's gonna be really, really good. So having these two ladies saying that I echo, that's what we need to do, and that's something that we're gonna be able to better our communities.
Thank you all for answering that question. I mean, I think even getting into a room like this where we have different people from different systems and different services where we can see each other face to face, I think the pandemic made it really difficult to make those warm referrals because people leave positions or they change positions and then we're not sure who's in what position. So use these spaces and these workshops as an opportunity to get to know each other better. And I think this is amazing that you all are here today to be here for the panel and for the workshops.